A walk on the wild side with a quartet of automotive fantasies. 4 exotic European cars up next on this special edition of MotorWeek.
MotorWeek, television's automotive magazine, is brought to you by the Robert Bosch Corporation, makers of Bosch Platinum, the ultimate spark plug for American and imported cars, and by S.p.A, makers of S.p.A oil treatment and S.p.A gas treatment. Your host for MotorWeek, John Davis.
Well, hello and welcome again to MotorWeek. Now and then we take a look at the world of exotic cars with a special road test we call the exotic slot. Well, this time it's one long exotic slot. 4 exotic vehicles are on view for the connoisseur or just for the curious. What is an exotic car? Well, it's an exclusive car that takes you away from the ordinary, a fantasy on wheels. That means cars like the Ferrari 328, the Lotus Turbo Esprit, the Lamborghini Jalpa, and the AC Mark IV. We've even got a future exotic to show you as Beth Nardone talks about the incredible Porsche 959. So let's step on the magic carpet then with the first name you think of when you mention modern-day exotics, Ferrari. Just hearing the name can get the adrenaline pumping. Maybe that's because Ferrari street cars have always been race cars at heart, ever since Ferrari designed his first engine back in 1946. But the Ferrari mystique is still going strong. We learned that when we drove one of Ferrari's latest cars, the 328. We also found out a few things we didn't expect. Let's face it, all exotic cars have reputations for being less than easy to live with. They're known for being uncomfortable, unreliable, and downright cantankerous. Except for this exotic, the Ferrari 328. It's a substantially upgraded version of the 308. That's the car that made Magnum famous. It continues to come in 2 flavors, delicious GTB or Berlinetta, that's Italian for coupe, and our GTS or Spider, which here isn't a true convertible, but rather a semi-open-air Targa. Cosmetically, the 328 differs most from the 308 in a better integrated front end. It bears more than a passing resemblance to the 512 Boxer. On the practical side, it provides better airflow for cooling than the 308's pointed affair. Most of the handsome Pininfarina lines are there, including the pop-up lights, the smooth front hood line that hides storage for the spare, the unmistakably large engine air inlets, and of course the sailplane-mounted wing. The gas cap is also still well disguised behind the sailplane accent panel. Tires are the same size as before too, 55 series front, 50 rear, but the design of the 16-inch rim is slightly smoother. Comfort seems assured with the 328. Not only are lots of luxury features standard, but they all work, and well. They'd better at the $63,000 take-it-or-leave-it price. The leather upholstered seats are first-rate. They're comfortable and supportive, and everyone found a workable driving position. On the console are LED air conditioning and vent switches with separate adjustment for the driver and passenger. The dash has been slightly reshaped from the 308, so main gauges are now more visible through the steering wheel. Most engine gauges are center dash mounted. And by the way, this car has no radio. It's an option. One other inside quirk, we like the door handle grabs that house the window lift switches. But get a load of where the inside door handles are hidden. The removable roof can be lifted off by one, but it's better to have a partner to help you put it back on. It stores neatly behind the seat. And that leaves a refreshing amount of luggage room in a zippered compartment behind the mid-mounted engine. Just right for a few select pieces of designer luggage. Speaking of all-important Ferrari power, the 328's numerical designation indicates an increase in engine size. Displacement of the fuel-injected V8 went from 3 to 3.2 liters. Output is up over 12% to 260 horsepower and 213 pound-feet of torque. Like the last 308, double overhead cams drive a complex 4-valve per cylinder arrangement. Also, as before, it gets to the road through a 5-speed gear change that works best warm and is quite smooth even with its gated shifter. Ratios have been altered to match the engine's new performance. And that performance can only be described as steamy. 0 to 60 in 6.8 seconds, quarter mile in 14.7 seconds at 96. Top speed up about 5 from the 308 at a bubbling 150. While suspension changes are minor compared to the 308, there is one major notation. The rear suspension is now exactly the same as the Ferrari Mondial, the smoothest riding Ferrari yet. So highway ride in the 328 is very good, firm but not harsh, and all in all very impressive. The same is true of handling. Steering is reasonably light and fast at 3.3 turns lock to lock. The 328 is one of the most stable machines on the road today. We found the handling most predictable and surprisingly forgiving. You don't feel as if much of the mass of the car is near the rear as on most mid-engine cars. You do have to steer a bit more than you expect at times, but never a lot. The 328's ability to handle trailing throttle oversteer is also outstanding. Brakes consist of a ventilated disc at each wheel. Again, the design is shared with the Mondial. Stops were very straight with no fade at an amazingly short 100 feet from 55. And what about reliability? Well, this car was in our care for only a few days, and at least for us, there were absolutely no problems with it. Characteristics, so we're told, of modern Ferraris. Reliable enough, heaven forbid, even to use every day. Sure, the price of a small house is a lot to pay for a small car. But then you can't look at a Ferrari 328 or any other exotic like just another car. Exotics are the ultimate in automotive craftsmanship, if not always in design. But in the case of the 328 GTS, it's both. Next is a car somewhat new to the world of exotics, this Lotus Turbo Esprit. You know, not too long ago, Lotus was selling kit cars. That was besides building all those world champion Formula One race cars. But since winning races was making them famous, Lotus decided to go for higher profit margins by building more elaborate cars in a higher price range. The Lotus Esprit, introduced in June of 1976, was one of them. In 1980, it got turbocharged. And around that time, the Esprit became a recognized member of the Exotic Club. Now it has a chair on the board of directors, but club membership hasn't meant that Lotus has become an imitator. Take a slow walk around this decade-old and much adjusted Giugiaro design shape. It's a vision of beauty and beast, with sensuous curves and severe angles. You might now call it more British eclectic than Italian modern, but it's still one of the most exciting exotics to look at. A deep chin spoiler drops to the road at the front. Along the sides, jet engine ductwork is used for brake cooling. Engine air is inducted by an inlet aft of the left rear window, just ahead of the exposed gas filler cap. The nonconformist theme continues inside too. The Lotus has a gratifyingly luxurious look. Crinkled leather seats surround a high shift tunnel. Yet the Turbo Esprit is a tight fit for anyone over 5'10". But once you do fit in, there's fingertip controls and clear gauge arrangement that make you feel like a fighter pilot in the Battle of Britain. And the car feels like a nimble fighter. You sit low, better to gain all the available sensations of speed and control. Thanks to our friend Scott Proper and his firm Motor Coach, we've sampled several recent Esprits. In each, we've been unsettled by the extremely limited outward vision, especially to the rear. It instantly makes you a cautious driver. But once you get going, the Lotus almost seems to respond to your thoughts. With the engine mounted amidships behind the driver but ahead of the rear wheels, the car has nearly perfect weight balance. Despite its $55,000 price tag, the Turbo Esprit is still a hip-high British sports car at heart. Driving it, you get the feeling that it could be made to dance on the head of a pin at just about any speed. At the front are elegantly crafted unequal length upper and lower wishbones with coil springs and tube shocks. A more complex series of upper and lower links and angled trailing arms are in the rear. Weight at the back wheels is further reduced since Lotus still mounts disc brakes inboard at the transaxle. They do a decent job of stopping the Esprit solidly from speeds much greater than our 55 mph test. But for the record, average distance here was 120 feet with little fade over 6 tries. Day-to-day life with the Lotus Turbo Esprit is not without compromises, though, that usually go with exotic cars. The ride is firm, but smooth enough unless you go looking for really rough roads. And we wouldn't recommend that. Ground clearance is less than 6 inches, and underbody repairs can be exotically costly. Under the louvered rear hatch and accompanying engine cover are the biggest changes in the Turbo Esprit for 1986. The Esprit has a 4-cylinder. That's uncommon in an exotic car, but it is technically advanced. This year, the fussy carburetors are gone, replaced by a modified K-Jetronic injection system. Better cooling of the 4-valve per cylinder all-aluminum design has also allowed for a higher combustion ratio, more turbo boost, and even better fuel economy. So with a net gain of 10 horsepower to 215, the Turbo Esprit is a gas guzzler no more. If it matters to you, EPA ratings are now 18 city and 26 highway. It's faster too. 0 to 60 in 6 seconds and a quarter-mile dash of 14.5 seconds at 95. Top speed rounds out to 150. The other big change to the Turbo Esprit this year has to do with driving sensation. A removable roof panel is now standard and doesn't detract from the car's already short headroom. The top stows in the already small luggage tray behind the engine, and that leaves just enough room for several small cloth bags or one long suit sack. The undersized spare tire and toolkit reside under the bonnet, and if needed, another flexible bag can fit there too. Now, fast car watchers know Lotus for advanced designs and also for questionable reliability. We're told the 1976 Lotus Esprits lived up to that less fortunate heritage, but the 1986 Turbo Esprit has changed, and so has Lotus itself. The company has just reorganized, and the new majority owner is none other than General Motors. No, they won't be hanging "Body by Fisher" labels on next year's Turbo Esprits, but they have pledged to use Lotus as an advanced engineering laboratory and to let its limited products continue without a change of character. That means the Lotus Turbo Esprit will be able to keep its well-earned seat on the World Board of Exotic Cars and still wear its own distinctive suit. Racing inspired both Ferrari and Lotus. But our next exotic, this Lamborghini Jalpa, came about from a rivalry between two men. The story goes that Ferruccio Lamborghini, an Italian industrialist, once dropped by the Ferrari offices for a chat with Enzo. Ferrari refused to see him, but then he refuses to see everybody. Lamborghini got mad and left, vowing to build better cars than Ferrari. Well, that threat has been a business since about 1963, though there has been a bankruptcy or two along the way. Today, the Countach is Lamborghini's best-known exotic, but the Jalpa is more comparable to the Ferrari 328. So, how does it compare? If the Ferrari is an orange, then the Lamborghini is an apple, which is to say it's easier to contrast the cars than to compare them. Ferraris tend to be cars of the mind. Lamborghinis are for the senses. You can tell that just by standing behind the Jalpa. Of course, it could be Jalpa, depending on what part of Italy you're from. At every gear change, the Jalpa, or Jalpa's overhead cam V8, lets out a growl that puts all your primal defenses on alert. The driver gets a shot of adrenaline too, going 0 to 60 in 6 seconds, quarter mile in 14.5 seconds at 93. Top speed, a thundering 148. But the Jalpa is a dare-to-be-different exotic in many ways. Like some examples of midlife masculinity, it's tucked in here, bulged out there, with body overlays that make it a brutish hulk. It's a constant chorus of pleasure and pain. Inside the Jalpa, there is more room than any other exotic we've driven. Legroom is generous enough for our tallest staff member, as is seat width for the broadest. Wonderful, right? Well, almost. The seats are low and the steering wheel position a bit high. At least you can see outside very nicely for an exotic. Gauges, both the main pod and the engine readouts on the right, are clear if a bit too recessed and far away. However, driver controls are crude, and though the clutch is very heavy, this lack of refinement is particularly true for the long throw shifter. Its gated pattern includes a reverse lockout tab that looks more at home on a tractor, which, by the way, is the Lamborghini firm's other claim to fame. There is no avoiding the sensation that you're driving the Jalpa's engine rather than the entire car. It sits just behind your head, so you're enveloped with a mechanical clatter. Sometimes that's romantic, and other times it's just noisy. On the other hand, when driving the Jalpa, you feel you're actually piloting some momentarily street-legal race car. This machine is not for the faint of heart. With a rearward weight bias, the Jalpa has a natural tendency to turn on its rear wheels. To counter that, steering is a very slow ratio with 4.2 turns lock to lock. That makes the car sluggish to respond in something like our slow-speed slalom. But at autostrada speeds, for which the car is obviously intended, it's probably just about right. The car is not kind to inexperienced behind the wheel. On the other hand, it probably forces owners to become better drivers. There are other traits, though, that make the Lamborghini a more practical exotic. Its single-piece Targa roof is easy to remove, and when it's stowed, the car retains very good body stiffness. Luggage space is also generous for its type. When not being used for carrying the top, there is usable space behind the seats, and at the rear is a deep well adjacent to the engine with a separate lid. The front compartment is for tire storage only. One of the notable aspects of the two Lamborghini Jalpas we sampled is quality of fit and finish. Both Lambos were flawless and most body seams are straight and even. I guess even the exotic car buyer has become more particular. Lamborghini reliability is another past point of interest. Our test car had only one minor malady. A throttle cable came loose, but we fixed it quickly, if not entirely gracefully.
I think that'll do it. To all of my friends in America, ciao, baby, ciao.
Although its $58,000 price tag is only $5,000 less than the Ferrari, the Jalpa isn't for every exotic car buyer. It's definitely a machine for the affluent who want all of the sensations of active driving. The Jalpa is a brute that requires 100% attention at all times. But it is a one and only Lamborghini. And for their select few owners, there just isn't anymore. Beth, I understand you have something new on wheels that might be called super exotic.
Yes, this is the fastest production car in the world, John, and only 200 of them will be made, so it's exotic all right, and it comes from Porsche. Now, the car started as Porsche's entry in Group B racing, and that's a category for modified production cars. But chances are it'll end up one of the most sought-after production cars we've ever seen. The 959 has all the high-performance handiwork for so-called sports cars of the future: anti-skid brakes, an adjustable suspension, and four-wheel drive. But this full-time four-wheel drive system has a variable torque split. It adjusts the amount of power that goes to each axle based on speed, road conditions, and driver demand. The 959 also gets a hollow wheel that holds air and uses an air pressure sensor to warn you when a wheel or tire is about to fail. Behind these wheels are anti-skid disc brakes, but unlike other systems, these work when the four-wheel drive differentials are in the locked position. These body intakes lead to intercoolers for the 959's twin-turbo flat six-cylinder engine, but the turbos work in sequence for better low-speed response. And that's an important thing for a small 2.8 liter that makes 450 horsepower. The result of Porsche's engineering? A 0 to 60 time of about 4 seconds and an incredible top speed of 206 miles per hour. But there's more to this land rocket than numbers. As you know, one member of our staff had a chance to drive the car at the Nürburgring race circuit in Germany. And he reports the 959 is not just fast. It's also as comfortable as any Boulevard GT and safer than most cars with half the power. Of course, he was lucky, since most of us will never get the chance to drive this car. Porsche has announced they won't export the 959. And even if they did, the cost would be as staggering as its speed, close to $200,000. But a few 959s will make it to American racetracks, and maybe even to the gray market, where the seller can name any price. So we won't see a production model Porsche 959, but we sure haven't heard the last of it.
There's lots of high-buck hardware on this car, Beth. What else are they likely to do with it?
Well, Porsche says future 911 models will have the four-wheel drive system, and I'd bet on the anti-skid brakes and adjustable suspension, too.
But no 450 horsepower. Okay. Thanks, Beth.
You're welcome, John.
Another healthy dose of power is coming up, a roadster from Britain called the AutoKraft AC Mark IV. Now that might sound familiar. The Mark IV is basically a 1986 version of the famous AC Cobra that won races and lots of speeding tickets back in the 1960s, and then went promptly out of production. Well, this new one is built using equipment from the original AC factory, but the car does use up-to-date components. So what happens when the old and the new come together to form an exotic car? It becomes a time machine. You steal from the past and cheat on the present all at the same time. The 1986 AC Mark IV has a body full of recent history. It's built in Britain by the new AutoKraft company. They formed the body panels and most other parts the same way AC did for the 1967 Mark III. We knew that car best as the AC Shelby Cobra 427. But Carroll Shelby and Ford both claim the Cobra name, so AutoKraft can only use the AC logo legally. Many other things about the car are the same now as then. The chassis is made up of 4-inch diameter steel tube. The top is a masterpiece of snaps and flaps. If it rains, forget trying to put it up, though we have seen it done in under 5 minutes. But that's only part of the novelty. Try the side curtains. They slide open and can be pulled off in a jiff. Those side curtains allow the Mark IV's doors to be thin, and the interior is 4 inches wider than in 1967. Cabin length is also up by half a foot, and the seats are near the original design. To bring them up to government specs, AutoKraft did add removable headrest. Still, who says you need roll-up windows? Actually, the interior of the Mark IV does have a modern air. Round gauges are vintage, but their script is current. Likewise, the climate controls and most all switches. However, you get only natural air conditioning. There is an adjustable steering wheel. It not only tilts, but telescopes too. The gearbox is modern, thank goodness. It's a BorgWarner T5. Probably the best for the money front-engine rear-drive manual shifter made. But take heart, there's plenty else to remind you just how British all sports cars used to be. The Mark IV's hardware looks like it's in a time warp. Protruding chrome license plate lamp, T-handle turning trunk lever, flip-open gas filler door, and dual-locking bonnet latches. Everything looks authentic, that is until you open the hood. The 7-liter Fomoco power of 2 decades ago has been replaced with last year's 5-liter HO motor. Engine compartment detail, like the polished firewall, is first-rate. Even though its 210 horsepower is tons less than the Cobra 427, it can still do a proper job, big bore 4-barrel and all. But take heed, when the current supply of engines is gone, fuel injection will take over. Neck snapping acceleration still remains king for the Mark IV. 0 to 60 is 6.1 seconds. For the record, that's about 2 seconds slower than the 1967 427. The quarter mile zoomed by in a remarkable 14.4 seconds at 93. That's more than adequate for whiplash. The wheels actually use wire locks for the spin-off hubs, and they are nice reproductions of the original Halibrads. Tires are now state-of-the-art Gatorbacks. The hub wrench looks like a dangerous weapon, though, and along with the full-size spare, takes up a good portion of the boot. The suspension is an upgrade of the old wishbone coil spring design, but it takes advantage of high-tech refinement in spring rates, shock response, and bushing stiffness. The steering gear is from the current Mustang GT. The result of all this is an almost civilized combination of ride and handling. It still takes a good grip of the small wheel, and the car doesn't always like to respond immediately to inputs, but with so much power, it can be coaxed out of turns with little fuss and a throaty roar. Getting sideways in a Mark IV is more fun than trouble. It stops pretty well too. Brakes are a large disc at each wheel. They take a lot of pedal pressure though, and we did have some locking at the right front wheel during the measured test. Average distance was 120 feet from 55. Later the same day, the brake lockup problem lessened, and distances seemed to be much shorter. So, how much for all this history in the remaking? Well, it's our cheapest exotic at $48,000, or for whatever the dealer can get. Each dealer acts as an independent importer for AutoKraft, and we'd like to thank Bob Begley of Clinton Ford for loaning us one of theirs. After all, only 35 cars will be flown here this year. That's 35 out of a total production of only 50. Talk about exclusive. But that is the name of the exotic car game. So if a Ferrari is too Italian, the Lotus too eclectic, and the Lamborghini doesn't quite match your self-image, you can always try some instant history. The AC Mark IV could even become a legend in its own right. Well, it's time to come down to earth with the inevitable question, are exotic cars really worth their prices? Well, here's one answer. While we were testing this foursome, we still had an '87 Chevrolet Camaro IROC Z with a Corvette engine in for testing. Even after flying around in the exotics, we still liked jumping back into the IROC. After all, a hunk of Detroit iron can provide its own kind of performance driving pleasure. But we'd still love to call an exotic car our own. You just can't get their combination of performance and prestige anywhere else. We'll see you next week on MotorWeek.
MotorWeek was brought to you by the Robert Bosch Corporation, makers of Bosch Platinum, the ultimate spark plug for American and imported cars, and by S.p.A, makers of S.p.A oil treatment and S.p.A gas treatment.